Hello and welcome to The Ordinary Show. I'm your host, Cheryl Brown, and tonight we're going to talk about what some would consider late-breaking news. If you are looking at your nightly news today or have been looking at it, it's a subject that's considered late-breaking news, but in actuality, it's a subject that is as old as time itself, the subject matter of oppression and civil unrest. I'd like to start off by giving my heartfelt sympathy to the family of Freddie Gray, the 25-year-old whose spine was severed while in the custody of police. Yet another tragedy that tarnishes the relationship in America between citizens and law enforcement. The late-breaking news is in Baltimore, Maryland, of course. Thousands of mourners and peaceful protesters came out in support of the Gray family, to include people like White House officials Eric Holder, Rev Jamaal Bryant, Rev Jessie Jackson, to name a few. And we have a clip to look at, to take a look at in just a second, that shows a little bit about what's going on in Baltimore in the situation right now. I'm going to try to pull up that clip. Just a second.
Smiling face, I think of you and wonder why. I might cry or smile, but at the end of the day, I am one day closer to you.
And on April the 12th at 8:39 in the morning, 4 officers on bicycles saw your son. And your son, in a subtlety of revolutionary stance, did something black men were trained to know not to do. He looked police in the eye. And when he looked the police in the eye, they knew that there was a threat, because they're used to black men with their head bowed down low, with their spirit broken. He was a threat simply because he was man enough to look somebody in authority in the eye. I want to tell this grieving mother, you ought to have your post checked out, because you are not burying a boy, you are burying a grown man who knew that one of the principles of being a man is looking somebody in the eye. At 8:40, your son began running from the police. He began running at 8:41. According to the timeline, he stopped. He stopped not because he was out of breath. He stopped not because he was a weakling. He stopped not because asthma had kicked in. He stopped because somewhere within the inner recesses of his own mind, he made up in his mind, I'm tired of living in a box. And so he stopped running.
The Baltimore police became the pallbearers of an alive man and turned the paddy wagon into a tombstone. We're here because we feel threatened. All of our sons are at risk. The number's not been called on yet. There's too much killing, too much hatred, too much violence, too much fear. In this community, he is more than a citizen. He's a martyr. Fred matters. Let nothing, family, stop you from marching. When you march, call his name. When you pray, call his name. And when you get there, Fred, tell him until we're still fighting. Tell Mayor Gibbons we're still fighting. Tell Diallo we're still fighting. Tell them we're not backing up. Tell them we're still marching. We're not mourning. Tell them the angels are flying. Tell them let nothing break them. Tell them keep hope alive through it all. Tell them through it all keep hope alive.
First, obviously, our thoughts continue to be with the family of Freddie Gray. Understandably, they want answers. And DOJ has opened an investigation. It is working with local law enforcement to find out exactly what happened, and I think there should be full transparency and accountability. Second, my thoughts are with the police officers who were injured in last night's disturbances. It underscores that that's a tough job, and we have to keep that in mind. And my hope is that they can heal and get back to work as soon as possible. Point number 3, there's no excuse for the kind of violence that we saw yesterday. It is counterproductive. Since Ferguson and the task force that we put together, we have seen too many instances of what appears to be police officers interacting with individuals, primarily African American, often poor, in ways that raise troubling questions. And it comes up, it seems like, once a week now. This is not new, and we shouldn't pretend that it's new. The good news is that perhaps there's some newfound awareness because of social media and video cameras and so forth that there are problems and challenges when it comes to how policing and our laws are applied in certain communities, and we have to pay attention to it and respond. What's also good news is the task force that was made up of law enforcement and community activists that we brought together here in the White House have come up with very constructive, concrete proposals that, if adopted by local communities and by states and by counties, by law enforcement generally, would make a difference. We can't just leave this to the police. I think there are police departments that have to do some soul searching. I think there's some communities that have to do some soul searching. But I think we as a country have to do some soul searching. But if we really want to solve the problem, if our society really wanted to solve the problem, we could. It's just it would require everybody saying this is important, this is significant. And that we don't just pay attention to these communities when a CVS burns. And we don't just pay attention when a young man gets shot or has his spine snapped. But we're paying attention all the time because we consider those kids our kids, and we think they're important, and they shouldn't be living in poverty and violence.
While violence is never
Protests
condoned,
became violent
right,
some 2 weeks after Freddie Gray was arrested in this West Baltimore neighborhood. The worst of it came after the official protest on Saturday that evening, focusing on Camden Yards, the baseball stadium. We were at the gates with protesters as they moved from City Hall to Camden Yards, confronting police who had gathered there behind barricades. Several police officers.
Okay, thank you. Technical difficulty slightly. But while, like I was saying, violence is never condoned, as one person once said that a riot is the voice of the unheard. And there are a lot of things going on where people are frustrated on both sides and looking for answers. As the president said, we need to find answers. But many are at a loss for words at this time, circling the atrocities that are taking place. So I borrow from the words from an educator, a columnist, Ta-Nehisi Coates' article in The Atlantic. So let's see what Ta-Nehisi Coates says in The Atlantic about, just to see what it says, nonviolence as compliance. So Ta-Nehisi Coates goes on to say that rioting broke out on Monday in Baltimore, an angry response to the death of Freddie Gray. And I'm going to move this over so I can see this a little better. Death by native city seems powerless to explain. Gray did not die mysteriously in some back alley, but in the custody of the city's publicly appointed guardians of order. And yet the mayor of that city and the commissioner of that city's police still have no idea what happened. I suspect this is not because the mayor and the police commissioner are bad people, but because the state of Maryland prioritizes the protection of police officers, and not just Maryland, I might add, charged with abuse over the citizens who fall under its purview. The citizens who live in West Baltimore, where the rioting began, intuitively understand this. Ta-Nehisi goes on to say that he grew up across the street from Mondawmin Mall, where the riots began. His mother was raised in the same housing project, Gilmore Homes, where Freddie Gray was killed. Everyone he knew who lived in that world regarded the police not with admiration and respect, but with fear and caution. People write these feelings off as wholly irrational at their own peril or their own leisure. The case against the Baltimore police and the society that superintends them is easier made. Over the past 4 years, more than 100 people have won court judgments or settlements related to allegations of brutality and civil rights violations. Victims include a 15-year-old boy riding a dirt bike, a 26-year-old pregnant accountant who had witnessed a beating, a 50-year-old woman selling church raffle tickets, a 65-year-old church deacon rolling a cigarette, and an 87-year-old grandmother aiding her wounded grandson. And in almost every case, prosecutors or judges dismissed the charges against the victims. If charges were filed at all, they were dismissed. In an incident that drew headlines recently, charges against a South Baltimore man were dropped after a video showed an officer repeatedly punching him, a beating that led the police commissioner to say that he was shocked. The money paid out by the city to cover for the brutal acts of its police department would be enough to build a state-of-the-art rec center or renovations at more than 30 playgrounds. Instead, the money was used to cover for the brutal acts of the city's police department and ensure they remained well beyond any semblance of justice. Now, on the news, you see politicians calling for young people in Baltimore to remain peaceful and nonviolent. These well-intended pleas, Ta-Nehisi says, strike me as the right answer to the wrong question. To understand the question, it's worth remembering what specifically happened to Freddie Gray. An officer made eye contact with Gray. Gray, for unknown reasons, ran. The officer and his colleagues then detained Gray. They found him in possession of a switchblade. They arrested him while he yelled in pain, and then, within an hour, his spine was severed. A week later, he was dead. Freddie Gray was dead. What specifically was the crime here? What particular threat did Freddie Gray pose? Why is mere eye contact and then running worthy of detention at the hands of the state? Why is Freddie Gray dead? That is the question. When nonviolence begins halfway through the war with the aggressor calling time out, it exposes itself as a ruse. The people now calling for nonviolence are not prepared to answer these questions. Many of them are charged with enforcing the very policies that led to Gray's death. And yet, they can offer no rational justification for Gray's death, and so they appeal for calm. But there was no official appeal for calm when Gray was being arrested. There was no appeal for calm when Jerry Lyles was assaulted. The blow was so heavy, my eyes swelled up. Blood was dripping down my nose and out of my eye. Quote, there was no claim for nonviolence on behalf of Venus Green, and they use an expletive here. B, you ain't no better than any other old black bee I have locked up. This is coming from the police. There was no plea for peace on behalf of Star Brown, who says, they slammed me down on my face, Brown added, her voice cracking. The skin was gone from my face. When nonviolence is preached as an attempt to evade the repercussions of political brutality, it betrays itself, Ta-Nehisi Coates says. When nonviolence begins halfway through the war with the aggressor calling time out, it exposes itself as a ruse. When nonviolence is preached by the representations of the state while the state doles on heaps of violence to its citizens, it reveals itself to be a con. And none of this can mean that rioting or violence is correct or wise. While this, any more than a forest fire can be correct or wise. Wisdom isn't the point here. Disrespect is. In this case, disrespect for the hollow law and failed order that so regularly disrespects the community. And that is an article that you can find by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it's entitled Nonviolence as Compliance in the Atlantic. My thoughts go a little deeper because, of course, Twitter was on fire last night, and I was up until 1 following the comments of CNN, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, Baltimore Sun, just a myriad of people. Almost broke the internet, the subject matter last night. And it was odd to hear the labeling that went forth from officials of the government, officials of Baltimore, who called the protesters who broke into the CVS and some looters, which were a small percentage. 99% of the protesters were peaceful, but the main coverage came when there were a few looters who set a property on fire. Then empathy, sympathy, whatever you want to call it, was ignited upon some people for the damage of property. My question is, where it was the sympathy and the empathy when this young man was crying out in pain that he needed medical help and his spine was severed, was cut? Where is the sympathy and empathy when the police officers are silent, they're suspended, they're not called thugs? People who have committed greater crimes, it seems to be quick to call these people thugs and criminals for breaking a window or looting, but people who commit greater crimes are not labeled with such titles. Violence, of course, is not the entire answer, but it seems some people who do not have the voice, or their voices have not been heard. This is their means of being heard, as we've seen in Ferguson. And one person even went on to say that Baltimore is not the same as Ferguson. It's not a racial issue. Okay, well, that's one opinion. But I and many others tend to see that it is somewhat of a racial issue. But the debate on Twitter and social media was on fire last night. But there were many who empathized with the Gray family and what's going on there. But it's sad to see that in America we're continually race baited. We're baited against each other, black and white. But many came out, black and white, to unite for the cause of racial justice, social justice. There was a time in the world where inequality was not based solely on color. That was solidified as systemic around the 1700s, and it just spread globally, where there was systemic injustices against people specifically for their color. So a lot of things under the surface seems like it's political, social, economic, but the underlying current a lot of times is racial injustice in America. There's an interesting book that I could recommend for reading that I found fascinating, and it's entitled Inhuman Bondage by a Pulitzer Prize winner, David Bryan Davis. And it talks about, you would be surprised at things that are in the book that you know, it seems like it's only going on late breaking news, but people have been protesting with fire for centuries, as we've seen in what we call third world countries. People don't have the same weaponry as larger countries, and you've seen it where people burn and set things on fire. But war is not the answer. I mean, we sing it in a song, we recite it to each other. War is not the answer, but we do need to learn to listen to each other. Martin Luther King, of course, you know, we borrow from him so often, but he talked about rioting as the voice of the unheard. And of course, we know Martin Luther King never condoned violence. He was a peaceful protester, but he also was wise in understanding the frustrations of the voiceless, the oppressed, the people that are systemically put aside as second-class, third-class citizens. And emotions erupt, especially at funeral times when there's a loss. A life was lost. Freddie Gray, who was who he was, but still not deserving of murder or whatever happened. You know, we do not know what happened, the facts, but he was one moment fine, healthy 25-year-old, and another, and within a minute, 60 seconds, his spine is severed. So, you know, it's no use even putting a name on the movement. You know, there was the Ferguson movement, but it's no use putting a name of one individual, because this is representative of atrocities in America against humankind. Trayvon Martin was a movement, but, you know, people standing together in solidarity, black and white, to show that these are inhumane conditions in America that need to be addressed, where mass incarceration is a major issue. People are incarcerated for petty issues, and people of color, and inordinate inordinate amount. A greater number of people of color are incarcerated for lesser crimes, to the point of people are uniting to say enough is enough. And it is a black and white issue in that blacks and whites are standing together to make a difference. So it's not just a black thing as far as people that are oppressed. We all need to read, be enlightened on what we can do to address the problem and see where it is we need to come up as a nation. We are an example of a nation. Our actions, other countries are looking at us. You know, we are always bragging about liberty, freedom, the pursuit of happiness. This is America. We have to do better. We have to do better. Martin Luther King said we either have to learn to live together as brothers or simply die together as fools. We're either going to have to learn to live. We don't know how to do it yet, but we have to learn to live together as brothers or die together as fools. Of course, Dr. King was a martyr. He stood behind what he believed, and we still believe today. But even during his time, people listened, but because of greed and evil agendas, I should say, it took the martyrdom of Dr. King to have some civil rights implemented. And even then, when they were implemented, it caused